Good evening. My name is Arthur Mata, the Director of Communications and Marketing for the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Welcome tonight for this important community lecture. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the Mayor of the City of New Bedford, Mayor John Mitchell.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know you're not here to see me. My ego's not that big, so I will be brief. We're pleased tonight to have John Gallagher here from the Detroit Free Press, whose book, Reimagining Detroit, has provoked considerable thought in policy circles as well as among citizens of cities all across the United States about what cities are going to look like in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years or so. And it's an exercise that we here in New Bedford have been engaged in a very active way in the last few years, and especially the last several months. We, like Detroit, on a much smaller level, in a city that has had fallen over a period of decades of tough times as we lost our industrial base. And the question is, how do we build on our assets to become something else? Not the textile center of the past, but something new and something different, something just as, if not more vibrant. And so this is an exercise that I think has to engage all of us as citizens. And this is by its very nature, a democratic process. I'm convinced that not every city in the United States, especially the smaller ones that have less diverse economies, are going to make it in the next 50 years or so. It's very hard, becoming increasingly difficult to compete on a global stage over now, and especially in areas that require higher levels of educational attainment that are often lacking in smaller cities. I've always maintained and continue to maintain and devoted myself to the idea that New Bedford is fundamentally different because we have certain assets that will, in the long run, enable us to compete. That's why we spend so much time figuring out how to capitalize on our waterfront, because it is, for us, an inherent advantage in competition in so many sectors. Commercial fishing, of course, recreational boating, but also in offshore wind, and that's an area that holds great promise, and we're making some real progress in that area. But there's another set of assets that enable us to compete that I think are all there, but sometimes not fully identified and sometimes underappreciated. That's our city's cultural assets. This whaling museum, for instance, things that make us a place that's different from everywhere else, that make us more interesting, more novel, and a place where the people who are looking for a high quality of life will want to be. And that's, part of a subscription to some of the things that Richard Florida and others have said, that if you create a place where people will want to be, businesses also will want to be there in the long run. But I think it's also something that we need to recognize that healthy cities have. They have amenities, they have features that attract people to them. Cities succeed or fail based on whether people want to live in them, whether people want to spend time in them. And so, that premise is really informed my approach to governing in the way that we're trying to shape the city in the future. In the last week, I got a lot of calls, including from the media, about why I was walking around, spending so much time walking around Route 18, around the overpass, the new overpass that's being finished over there, just checking things out, looking, and of course the State of Times is right across the street, and evidently piqued their curiosity. So the reporters were standing up across the windows on the second floor looking out. I heard all about it there. And the reason for that is that we're completing this large infrastructure project there that ultimately is going to be landscaped in a way that's going to determine whether people like it, whether it appeals to people coming to the city and living here. And it matters a lot. And so it's one of these public spaces that can distinguish cities from the pack. It can distinguish cities from suburbs. If you build great public spaces in cities, people will want to live there. I recently was at a convention down, a conference, a handful of mayors down in South Carolina, and it was a planning conference. And John, you're probably familiar with the Mayor's Institute of City Design. Great brainstorming session among 6 mayors or so. Mayor Phoenix, Kansas City, Knoxville, New Bedford, Hartford, and we were talking about planning challenges and presenting planning challenges that we have in our cities. But it was a very useful exercise. But what stuck with me the most were the comments of Mayor Joe Riley of Charleston, who is the longest-serving mayor in America, and who has really turned Charleston into a jewel of historic preservation. And he related a story about a fellow that he came up to on sitting on a pier at a waterfront park that they built. And if you're familiar with Charleston, they have a beautiful waterfront park that's less than 10 years old. It's just a stunning space. And the guy was just sort of sitting there, dangling his feet on above the water, and the mayor came up to him and said, so-and-so, what are you doing? He said, well, I don't have to be at work today. But he said, why are you here? And the guy said, well, because it's just so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. And if you can, and in that moment, really captured why the public spaces matter in cities. Here's a guy who wanted to be there because of the beauty of it all, and it made him feel good about his city. And that's what we're really striving to achieve. If you can do that in the city will be any suburb, anywhere. And so these types of things matter. And as we look to the future, it's about economic competitiveness, but it's also about creating a place where people will want to be and want to work. And so that's what we're striving for. Those are the things that we're thinking about as a city, and the kind of discussion that John and others have contributed to over the last few years, especially in the great urban laboratory of Detroit, really helped the cause, really forced us to think about our priorities. And so we're really grateful for your contribution, John, and looking forward to gaining just a couple of insights in this hour. If I can walk out of here with a couple of nuggets to put away this evening, we will be well served here in New Bedford. So I want to commend UMass Dartmouth for its work in creating this program, Pat Doughton, and everyone else who's contributed to this effort, because I think it's important, a very important discussion for New Bedford to have in order for us to shape our future in an informed way, in a way that we can control. When I say control our own destiny. If we have our destiny in our hands, I think we will, in the long run, have a better place. So anyway, with that, I won't go on any further, and I don't know, I think Adrian is introducing John right now. I think that's Thomas. Well, why don't you come on up and do the introduction, but thank you for having me tonight. I appreciate it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of the Creative Economy Lecture Series. My name is Thomas Stubblefield. I'm an art history professor at UMass Dartmouth, and my colleague Pamela Karimi and I are so excited that you all have come out tonight. We know the weather has not been cooperating lately, so it means a great deal to us. In recent years, it's become clear that a new set of challenges have begun to face... Does the microphone just go out? Yeah. It's okay, I think. At least for now. So in recent years, it's become clear that a new set of challenges have begun to face American cities where industrial production once supplied the economic lifeline. These post-industrial urban spaces now bear witness to the recent recession of 2008, but a whole host of enduring economic factors which include outsourcing, decreases in local tax revenue, and high unemployment. These developments are intimately linked to increasing automation in the mode of production, population shifts, and a broader move away from industrialized modes of production. All of this has brought to light an urgent need to reconceptualize the 21st century, which the mayor mentioned, and its economic, the 21st century city, and its economic, social, and cultural function. Is there a way to just turn this off?
I don't think you need it.
Yeah. Okay. Apologies for the sound. So, to grapple with these issues, Professor Karimi and I have brought together 10 preeminent thinkers in the field for a year-long lecture series. And while this is not the first series to deal with these topics, what we think is new and unique is the way in which this series will engage with the community. Not only in terms of the lectures and having feedback from you all and interacting with the scholars, but we're also including in this series a show at the New Bedford Art Museum of local artists dealing with the theme of urban renewal, especially as it relates to New Bedford. So we essentially envision this project as an extended dialogue with the community, and that's why we're so happy that all of you are here. And hopefully you all got a chance to look at the poster as you came into the room, and you'll see that we have an event almost every month. If you didn't get a chance to sign in on the sign-in sheet that went around, please do, because we'll have email reminders going out several weeks in advance for all of the upcoming events. So before we get started, I want to thank a handful of people. First of all, the President's Office at UMass, the UMass system, who supplied us with a very important grant. Really, this project would not be possible without the Creative Economy grant we received. Pat Dalton, who was already mentioned. Laura Ryan, our artist and creative consultant. James Mignorn, the graphic designer who designed the wonderful posters you see outside. Allison Seiwin and the Visual Resources Center at UMass Dartmouth. Our student interns, Lauren Sharp, Betsy Jennings, and Thea Landry. The Whaling Museum and the Buzzards Bay Coalition for providing the facilities. And last, I want to thank Adrian Teo, the Dean for the College of Visual and Performing Arts, who is with us tonight, and he will say a few words to kick off the series. So thank you everyone for coming, and hope to see you at future lectures.
So I'll stand over here since I don't have a microphone. Good evening, everyone, and it's my honor as the Dean of the College of Visual and Performing Arts at UMass Dartmouth to welcome you to tonight's lecture on urban renewal and the creative economy in Massachusetts with a focus on the gateways of cities and beyond. Tonight's talk deals with Detroit, which John and I spent 17 years just south of Route 17 in Bowling Green, Ohio. So Detroit well, I know where the Utrecht is. As many of you already know, New Bedford has become a leader among the dozen or so gateway cities in Massachusetts. The arts in particular have been central to this recognition. Richard Florida, mentioned earlier, noted that of all the cities in the United States that have a good place for artists to live and work, New Bedford ranks 7th nationally in offering that opportunity. Now, this is important to us and important to the university as well. The university is proud to have played a prominent role not only with the Star Store, which many of you are aware of, but also the Cherry Building. We rebuilt both of those buildings, are central to downtown, and as you know, we have about a $43 million project that's now working with SMS on the south end. So this issue of reimaging is very important to, I think, both groups. Students now who graduate from CVPA and SMS and other institutions in Bedford are more likely to stay here and begin their professional careers here, largely because of the experience they had as students and because of affordable housing and studios, two very important categories. Tonight's lecture by author and journalist John Gallagher is made possible by the UMass President's Creative Economy Award, one of 9 that were offered this year, and 2 of which went to UMass Dartmouth. So I do want Pamela and Thomas to stand and be recognized. These are very, very difficult awards to get. They're a $25,000 award. And I think they need to be publicly acknowledged for being able to offer one and actually bring it here to New Bedford. So stand up and sing. They are the future of UMass Dartmouth. And I also want to salute the students here from the Art History Club. You call them interns, that's good. Art History Club members as well, thank you for being here. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Pamela Creevy, who's actually going to introduce the speaker. Pamela.
Thank you very much. It's my honor, everyone, to introduce John Gallagher, who's a veteran journalist and author, whose latest book, Reimagining Detroit, Opportunities for Redefining an American City, was named by the Huffington Post as Huffington Post as among the best social and political books of 2010. John is a native of New York City. He joined the Detroit Free Press in 1987 to cover urban and economic redevelopment efforts in Detroit and Michigan, a post which he still holds. His other books include Great Architecture of Michigan, and as co-author, AIA Detroit, the American Institute of Architects Guide to Detroit Architecture. John and his wife, Sheu-Jane, live along Detroit's east riverfront. Without further ado,
thanks for your interest, and thanks to the invitation from UMass Dartmouth. I'm delighted to be here to kick off the series. I'd encourage you to come to as many of these as you can, because much as we like to think so, none of us has a lock on all the wisdom about cities, and there's a lot you can learn from everyone else. And I have to say, just based on my one day, I arrived this morning in New Bedford for the first time. There's a lot here that I really, really like a lot. The use of the old buildings, the remaking of the waterfront, and so on. So one of the places that I think we can look at as an example of what to do is right here. And the mayor hit it right on the head when he said that policy is to take a look at what a lot of people think of as urban problems and start to think of them as urban assets. That we can be better cities, whether it's a city like New Bedford or a city like Detroit, we can be a better city, not just in spite of all the bad things that have happened to cities, but in some ways because of those things, because now you can do certain things. If you have a building that used to be a factory and now it's empty, well, that's a calamity, but it's also an opportunity to do something new. And so a lot of the breakthrough we've made intellectually the last few years is just to think of our urban assets in new and different ways. So to kick off tonight and the whole series, I like to start with an image of sort of an ideal city when we talk about placemaking and so on, and walkable urbanism. What do we mean? So I chose an image of Paris from the 1890s by the famed Camille Pissarro. This is in the National Gallery of Art. He calls this Boulevard des Italiens, and it's just filled with people and vehicles and buildings and that sense of vitality that we all think of as a city. And so for me, something like this would be the ideal image of what a city is. And of course, you could overlay a photograph of any American city from, say, 1940 or 50, and it would look exactly like this, except it'd be cars instead of carriages. But this is sort of, the ideal of what we think about when we think about a city. And we don't think of a city as looking something like this. This is a shot from Detroit's east side that I took a couple of summers ago. And there used to be a hospital on this site. It was torn down many years ago. And there's so little demand for sites like this in a city like Detroit, which has been so abandoned, that now you have lots and lots and lots of places that look like this in the city. And so one way to think about tonight's lecture is, how do we get from the first image to the second, or how do we get from the second image back to the first? But vacancy is something that we're seeing a lot of in the city. Now, how did it happen briefly? I don't spend a lot of time on history. I prefer to talk about the future and what we can do. But just briefly, two things happened after World War II, and one of them very well in New Bedford, and that's deindustrialization. The factories closed, the work went somewhere else for a whole lot of reasons. And there's a long history of great literature on deindustrialization and explaining how it happened. And the other thing is suburbanization. Cities spread out following World War II. All cities spread out. Cities that we think of as empty and shrinking, like Detroit, are actually much larger than they were 50 years ago, except that the population is all in the suburbs. So all the urban areas just spread out. And the great difference between cities that we think of as failures, like Detroit and Gary, Indiana, and Flint, and so on, and cities that we think of as successes, like Houston and Dallas and Phoenix, is that the Sun Belt cities were allowed to capture all that suburban growth through annexation, and the older cities were not. So just as a simple illustration, the little cone on the left represents the size of Detroit, then and now, 139 square miles. The little smudge in the middle is Phoenix in 1950 at 17 square miles, and the tall cone on the right is the size of the city of Phoenix today, at over 500 square miles. So all those Sun Belt cities, Albuquerque, Dallas, Phoenix, Houston, were allowed to annex much of their suburban growth, and so they remained much healthier fiscally. And of course, all the older cities, Cleveland, Buffalo, St. Louis, and whatever, Detroit, We're not allowed to do that, and that's where a lot of their problems come from. Now, what that gives you, the fact that all these cities spread out, the population density in our cities has dropped quite a bit because we've spread it out over a wider area. So in Detroit, the population density in 1950 was about 15,000 people per square mile. Now it's about 5,200 per square mile because so many people have left. The suburban areas are about 3,000 people per square mile, so they're less densely populated. Even though there's more people out there, they're spread out further. And all these Sunbelt cities like Phoenix is only about 3,000 people per square mile. So even though we think of Phoenix as this amazing boom town, the population density in Detroit is twice as much as it is in Phoenix, because Phoenix is like a huge suburb that spreads out over hundreds of square miles. So, at any rate, what you're left with in all the older central cities is a lot of excess urban assets, empty homes, empty factories, and empty land. And a lot of what the new thinking is about is, well, what do you do with all that excess urban capacity? We're going to be in Detroit for a bit here. Detroit's the most strategic spot of the Great Lakes. And a lot of what we think about when we think about Detroit is places like this. This is the old Packard plant in Detroit. This was the most modern factory in the world when it opened in the early 1900s. It was closed in the late 50s after 50 years of turning out Packard automobiles. And it's been like that. It's been slowly rotting away ever since. When the documentary filmmakers come to a place like Detroit to film what we have taken and called ruin porn, they come usually to the Packard plant. When Time Magazine did their cover story of the tragedy of Detroit a few years ago, they came here. And there's certainly a lot of this that you can see in Detroit and all the old industrial cities. But of course, there's also a great deal of vacant land. And the land, the empty land on which no buildings remain, is a growing issue. And it's growing because the problem of abandonment and vacancies in our cities is not static, it's dynamic. 30 years ago, we might be dealing with buildings, empty buildings on this site. But eventually those buildings fall down, burn down, or demolished because they get blighted. And there's a growing stock of vacant land in a lot of our older cities. Now there's a new conference called the National Vacant Properties Campaign that has begun in the last few years to deal with this. And the interest in it is growing enormously. The first one was about 5 years ago. I was at the second one in Louisville where they had 400 people attending, and I was the only journalist who had signed up to cover it. The next one was in Cleveland. They had 900 people and a dozen journalists who had signed up. So the interest in sort of vacant land inside cities is growing exponentially. Now you might ask, how did a neighborhood that was filled with homes 30 years ago come to look like this? There's really two reasons. And one, again, is deindustrialization. When you lose factories, you tend to lose big chunks of real estate. In Flint, Michigan, the home of the birthplace of General Motors, there was a Chevy factory down along the river. It was known as Chevy in the Hole because it's a low area down along the river. And when that factory was demolished, they had a 110-acre vacant lot, basically. It's been there for several years, and they're still trying to figure out what to do with it. So vacant land inside cities comes partly because factories took up a lot of space. The other reason is that the housing stock in a place like some cities was based on wood frame single-family homes. You have a lot of that here in New Bedford. Although I noticed when I came into the homes, they're taller here than in Detroit. You have three-story homes here. We have bungalows and cottages and so on in Detroit. But those don't hold up very well to abandonment. A lot of cities, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, have brick apartment buildings as their main housing stock. And they just hold up a lot better. When I was researching my book, I went to Philadelphia, and I said, take me to a distressed neighborhood. And they took me to the north end of Philadelphia. And they stopped and they said, no, this is the most, drug-scarred, poverty-ridden, crime-ridden neighborhood in the state. And I look and I see solid brick apartment buildings all around the square. And I go, oh, this looks pretty good. It still looks like a city. I will take this in Detroit anytime. But in Detroit, because we have all these cottages and bungalows that just don't hold up very well, we have mile after mile of this sort of thing in Detroit now. Now, we also have wonderful neighborhoods along the riverfront, throughout the city. And we're still a city of 700,000 people, which is a lot of people. It's still a top 20 city, even though people think no one lives in Detroit anymore. But we do, we're honest, we have tons of this kind of stuff. And so the debate really, as Mayor said, Detroit is the great urban laboratory, which is true. We look at ourselves as the world's great urban laboratory. And people come from all over the world to look at Detroit right now. Every week, I show around another documentary filmmaker, urban planner, architects, students, and whatever. People doing research on cities, and they all sort of want to figure out what to do, what's going to happen in Detroit. So we'll look at some of the vacancy just to give you sort of the canvas of what we're talking about. Lots of space, lots of neighborhoods that went away, streets that are more or less abandoned now, and look like this. Some of this is a little bit self-inflicted. This is a neighborhood that the city thought it was being abandoned pretty rapidly, so the city said, well, we'll take it over and we'll make it an industrial park. So they took over almost 200 acres, demolished all the homes, closed off the streets, and then nothing has happened in 15 years. So we're still waiting to see what's going to happen. But this is when you get the notion of this wide, what we call urban prairie. This is kind of the stuff we're talking about. By common consent, there's more of this stuff in Detroit than anywhere else. St. Louis has an awful lot. Youngstown, Ohio looks a lot like this, but Youngstown is a lot smaller city. So again, by common consent, Detroit is the place where you go to deal with sort of vacant urban land. This is a neighborhood called Brightmoor on the west side of Detroit. This was farmland until the 1920s. Then the people from the deep south in Appalachia moved out to work for Henry Ford. His factory was nearby. And this was a real solid working class neighborhood until about the 1970s. And then this is what 40 years of abandonment and arson and so on, and white flight, and all the rest of that does. This is one of the old factory sites that was torn down when I arrived in Detroit in 1987. This was a Chrysler factory. It was torn down a year or two later, and it's been vacant ever since. The sign that says available, call this number, that's completely collapsed now. This picture is about 5 years old. So anyway, another industrial site that's come down. The one on the left is a neighborhood in Detroit in 1949. All those black dots are homes or buildings, and one on the right is the same neighborhood in 2009. So you can see the level of abandonment in some neighborhoods. Now it's interesting that if you were out in some exclusive suburb, the land pattern would be look like the one on the right. Where they have 2-acre lot, minimum lot zoning and all that sort of stuff, wide setbacks. Again, Detroit has a relatively dense population pattern compared to some of the other cities. But it's just that we got here through abandonment and arson and crime and a lot of other stuff, and a lot of the suburbs got here through planned development. They want it to look like this. We don't want it to look like this. We want it to look like the one on the left. Now, a friend of mine named Alan Malik, who's an urban planner, developed this map, and he suggests that we're going to have cities that are going to develop where you have the urban core, the downtown, and urban villages, which would be the neighborhoods that are still strong. And then in between, you'd have opportunity areas, which basically is another word for vacant land. Or they could be buildings in some cities, like in Bedford, you might have more buildings that are empty than actually vacant land. But that we're developing this pattern of large areas inside of traditional cities that are largely vacant and provide opportunities for something new. And as we talk about reimagining cities today, it's largely about what are you going to do with that stuff. Now, the traditional answer is, let's build new homes, let's build new factories, let's build new stores. But there's so little market demand in some of these areas that you can't do that. You need to come up with some other creative way to think about that. And this whole notion is relatively new. I mean, up until a few years ago, people would have said, come up with just the right tax credit, just the right formula, just attract just the right new industry, and you'll fill up all the factories and fill up all the homes in the 1950s all over again. And now we're admitting that's not going to happen, and we're going to do something else. So what do? Well, I'm going to start with the small stuff that's taking place sort of on the ground. One thing that's happening is that in Detroit and elsewhere is that the people who remain, the homeowners who are still there, are spreading out to take over the vacant land. So here's a homeowner who had a vacant lot next to his house. That's who they. And this happens a lot. There's a professor at University of Michigan, who studied the one neighborhood in Detroit, Brightmoor, about 15 blocks by 15 blocks, about 500 examples of this in that neighborhood. People, sometimes if you have families living a couple of doors apart with vacant lots in the middle, they fence it in and create a family compound. They may do one on one side and one on the other side of the house. Here's someone who took about 3 lots and created a playscape for his kids and a garage and whatever. People do community gardens, they do all kinds of stuff on here. But part of the answer of what's happening with vacant land inside cities is that some people are just squatting, basically, spreading out to take it over on their own. Now, some scholars have looked at this and call these blots, a contraction of blot and block, because it's bigger than a lot and smaller than a block. I refer to as side lot, but you see a lot of this in Detroit. So one answer is that the city is slowly evolving into a more suburban style landscape, except it's happening in this very unofficial way. Most of these, by the way, are not done, at least in Detroit, they're not done officially by going down to City Hall and buying the lot. City government in Detroit, I'm sure, is less efficient than city government here. It's very hard to understand who owns property in Detroit. Not only is it mostly, a lot has been abandoned, but it's been subject to mortgage fraud, title fraud, and a lot of other stuff. So it's hard to even know who owns some of this. So people just do this. And this one professor who studied these, the 500 examples that she found, 40% were registered with the assessor's office and 60% were not. So probably 2/3 were just happening. And someday, if we ever do have large-scale redevelopment, it's going to be quite a trick to unravel who owns what in some of these places. Now, another thing that's happening, unofficially, again, is people just do things like this, little treatments of the neighborhood. This is a neighborhood project in Detroit, in that Brightmoor neighborhood, where this costs almost nothing. It's a neighborhood project that makes people feel good, and you see stuff like this all over Detroit, and in other cities too. There's a lot of cities that are allowing this stuff to happen. This happens unofficially. That is, without official blessing. They don't go out and buy this lot. It just sort of happens. But it's one of the things that gives neighborhoods in Detroit some life and gives it a sense that people actually care, and we should encourage this kind of thing, even though it's very unofficial. You see things like this in Detroit. This is a park that the city no longer maintains, and so the neighbors got together and created this ground sculpture, which they call Memory Field, as if remember what Detroit was at one time in its heyday. And as you drive around Detroit, you see stuff like this all over. Guerrilla artworks springing up on vacant lots, little things that neighbors have done. So a lot of what's happening in some of our older cities is that the people who remain are pretty feisty. They refuse to give up. They have pretty feisty neighborhood groups, block clubs, and they do these projects like this. And on a slightly more official way, you have pocket parks that spring up in a lot of places. This used to be a building here in Detroit, and now for not very much investment, you can do something like this, and this helps. And I'm going to stop in Philadelphia for a moment here. Philadelphia is the master at cleaning up vacant lots. They have a program called Philadelphia Green, whose purpose is to, number one, plant trees, but also to reclaim vacant lots. And they can take a lot like this and turn it into this. So I'll just go back and forth to it because this is pretty interesting. In the last 12 years or so, Philadelphia Green has done about 5,000 of these lots in Philadelphia, in the poorest areas of Philadelphia. They clean up the trash, they plant new grass, they plant some new trees, and they do this little post-rail fence around it, and the fences become their trademark. They started off doing chain link fences, but chain link fences are pretty forbidding, and also trash collects along the base of the chain link fence. And so they switched out these, and now you see these lots by the thousands in Philadelphia. This is very economical. They can do this, they can clean it up, and they can maintain it all summer, which is they cut the lawn about once a week in the summer for about $5,000 per lot, which is not too bad. I mean, the foundation is well funded, and they do a lot of this sort of thing. And now this little notion is being picked up by a lot of other cities. In Youngstown, Ohio, for example, they have a program where they've got several dozen lots, not 5,000. but where they do their fence and the lot reclamation. So there's been a lot of effort put into sort of reclaiming the city at the lot level, the vacant lot level. And then, of course, there's urban farming, which everyone talks about, and both in a good way and a bad way. I have callers who say, Detroit's nothing but abandoned factories and urban farms, so they think this is really bad. And other people say, well, the city's been abandoned, we can make it a farm. The whole place will be a farm. It's actually, it's a selective thing that you can do that's very helpful in some ways. This one is known as Earthworks. This is actually one of the best ones in the city. It's about 2 acres. It's run by a soup kitchen, and they grow the food here for a soup kitchen. They do beekeeping. They produce several hundred pounds of honey every year, an amazing variety of crops. And it's like virtually all urban farms in America is run by volunteers. There's 2 or 3 paid staffers, but hundreds of volunteers come in. The food is given away, in this case to the soup kitchen. A lot of urban farms, they give it away to your neighbors, or you pick it yourself or whatever. But they're not commercial businesses, and that's a key thing to understand. They're neighborhood projects in almost all cases. Here's one in Detroit. My wife and I grew some tomatoes and carrots and things here. Again, just an abandoned lot that the neighborhood groups take over. And again, the food is just kind of given away. Well, it's volunteer labor, and it's a very sort of unofficial thing to do. And you see these in many, many cities now, all over Detroit. Certainly, there's hundreds and hundreds of these in Detroit. And it's important to remember that these are, there's a saying in community gardening. Community gardening is more about community than gardening. It's not really about raising a lot of food, even though the advocates talk about how much food they're raising and how many poor folks they're feeding and that sort of stuff. But my observation is it's really about getting the neighborhood together to work on some project that helps organize people around some useful service. I mean, when we worked in our community garden, we had a few heads of lettuce, some tomatoes, some carrots, but I mean, not much. There's not a lot of food. Some urban gardeners would stand here and tell me I'm crazy for saying that there's all kinds of food produced, but I think it's really more about organizing, community organizing. And in fact, it's used across the country for all kinds of things. In Philadelphia, they do prisoner reentry through community gardening. Battered women shelters use community gardening, immigrant assimilation, workforce training. There's all kinds of things that urban gardening is used for. This is an old gas station site in Detroit. Because the ground was too contaminated, they cap it, and then they build these raised beds, these boxes, and import fresh dirt and grow their vegetables. And this one's in the Midtown district, which is the University Museum district. So these boxes are rented by the season to restaurants in the area. And if you buy salad greens in a restaurant in Midtown Detroit, it's probably growing right here a block away. Youngstown, Ohio. A great steel town that was almost lost everything after the 70s. Their population has gone down by about 2/3 in 50 years. Detroit and Youngstown have about the same percentage population decline of about 62% from their peak years. But population declines of 40% are common. In the United States, cities like Cleveland and St. Louis, 45–50% population declines are common. Even Chicago, one of the great successful cities, is 25% down from where it was at its peak. So anyway, in Youngstown, you notice the fence, a little different fence than they had in Philadelphia, but the same notion: take a vacant lot that was abandoned, create a community garden, dress it up a little bit with some fence or some landscaping, and you have something. And this is a before shot in Philadelphia of quite a large site, 2 acres, and there's the after site. So they have this, all the gardening on this side, and then the community meetings area here, then another whole gardening area that comes over here. And within 10 minutes of downtown Philadelphia. So urban gardening is a trend all over Milwaukee, Chicago, and New York City. They have urban gardens. And the question that really comes up now is, since these are all community building exercises, can you scale up community gardening into commercial farming inside cities like Detroit and actually make it a business, get some economic development out of it? This is a woman from Holland, actually, who moved to Detroit and does community gardens in Detroit. Here's a couple of community gardeners in Detroit. And these kind of folks, these do amazing work, but these typically do not want commercial farming inside cities. They see it as a corporate land grab. They see the exploitation of Detroiters. They see it as, hear terms like plantation economy and so on. But on the other hand, you have, images like this, which would represent, it's a rendering, architectural rendering of what an urban farm might look like. And in some spots in Detroit where you have these vast areas that are abandoned and with no market demand for new houses or whatever, this begins to seem like a pretty good thing to try. Now, whether it actually works, I don't know. Farming is a low margin kind of business, and it's hard to get people to work on a farm, which is why migrant farm workers are found all over the country. But I think that it's at least probably worth trying as an experiment in our cities. And we are going to be doing that in Detroit soon. There's two projects, one of which would be about 200 acres, one of which would be about 60 acres, that are now working their way through the approval process, and we're probably going to get that, at least try it pretty soon. This is a gentleman named Gary Wozniak in Detroit on the site that he's going to create a 60-acre farm. Interesting story. He was a stockbroker in the 80s. He made a lot of money, most of which went for cocaine. He spent 3 years in federal prison and came out and got involved in a drug addiction recovery center, which he's been with ever since. And because their budget is strapped, one day he said, well, why don't we think about urban farming? Make some money and put all our clients to work. Their clients are the inner city folks who come out of the system, the criminal justice system, and very little education, a lot of illiteracy. As Gary says, plants don't care if you can read or write. You can teach some rudimentary job skills and get people some jobs, and also creating processing, because the money is in the processing, and the marketing and the retailing. So Gary's got a project called Recovery Park, which we built on this site, which is a former high school site. The high school was demolished. And you'll probably see this probably in the spring, actually starting. It's been a long, bitter debate in Detroit over allowing large-scale commercial farming. As I said, the community farmers were completely against it. Most of them are into community farming because they want to live off the grid. They don't want to have a corporate system. And so the farming that we're going to get in Detroit, if it succeeds, would be more of a hybrid, sort of a non-profit effort like what Gary's going to do. But we probably will see some larger scale farms in a place like Detroit. There's art. And I know we have a lot of art history people here and art students. This is the Heidelberg Project in Detroit. And public art is now getting a huge amount of attention as not only as something to fill up some vacant land, not only as something because art and culture are good for the soul, but because it's also got economic development possibilities too. So the Heidelberg Project, Heidelberg is a street in Detroit, and the artist named Tyree Gallagher, who grew up there, was upset that it was being abandoned. This house, by the way, is where Helen Thomas, the reporter, grew up. And he was upset, Tyree was upset that it was being abandoned, and so he started to do stuff like this to it. And polka dots, sort of the theme was connect dots, connect all of us together. Taking all these found objects, cars, shoes, shopping carts, whatever, painting them and installing them in different ways. And the city, when he started to do this, the city thought he was crazy. And actually bulldozed this flat twice in the early years. But it's just celebrated its 25th anniversary. Tyree is finishing a year-long fellowship in Switzerland for artists. His work is shown in the Detroit Art Museum and other museums. And this is now one of the main tourist attractions in Detroit. So when I show people around town, this is the spot they all have to get out of the car and take pictures, and it's just delightful. When I first saw it, I thought it was pretty crazy, but it's really grown on me, and I know Tyree a little bit, and And I like this a lot. So there's huge examples of public art, official and unofficial, in cities everywhere. We're back to Philadelphia here. The Philadelphia mural program is probably the best in America. It started out as part of the mayor's anti-graffiti program about 20 years ago. They hired a wonderful woman named Jane Golden, who's a muralist, to come and run that part of the anti-graffiti program. And Jane started to hire graffiti artists to paint murals instead. And now they employ about 60 people, staff people, year-round. They hire about 300 artists a year to work on these murals. And they've done something like 5,000 murals in Philadelphia. And you'll be amazed at the size and number and quality of the murals in Philadelphia when you visit there. Notice also the fence. This is one of these vacant lots that's been reclaimed, the fence and the landscaping. And so as you drive around Philadelphia, neighborhoods that are pretty distressed, you see this sort of thing all over. They've done enough of these long enough so that some of the academics in Philadelphia have begun to study the benefits of these. And there have been papers, published papers that found both a property value benefit for the neighborhood when you do something like this, and also a reduction in crime when you do something like this. It's sort of the opposite of the old broken window theory. If there's a broken window, everything goes to heck. If you fix the window, everything improves. It seems to be that sort of effect. So public art is being used in Philadelphia this way. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, Amway, the famous sort of direct marketing, whatever. There's a young man named Rick DeVos. He's the grandson of the founders of Amway. And Amway is a fairly controversial company because of the economic model they use to get people to sell their products. But the families have given back bazillions of dollars to Grand Rapids. I mean, every museum and stadium and hospital in town is named after one or two families. And young Rich DeVos, the grandson, who's now about 30, wanted to do something that involved public art. So he started something called Art Prize 3 years ago. They just finished the third year, in which they invite artists anywhere in the world to come in and create a work of art that will be in any public venue in the city. So this year they had about 2,000 artists, 2,000 works of art. This is the convention center in Grand Rapids, but they're on vacant lots, they're in parking garages. Somebody did a sculpture, they hung it between two downtown buildings. And each year they bring in a huge amount of people and pump millions of dollars into the Grand Rapids economy. It runs for 3 weeks. The public votes on it, what they like. And the winner gets $200,000. It's said to be the biggest art prize in the world. And because there was some controversy over what the public was voting for, there's now also a jury prize of $100,000. So they get about two enormous prizes every year. And here's the crowds on a weekend. So if anyone wants to know if art and culture is good for economic development, well, here you go. I think I don't have a slide for it, but I think the best example is the town of Stratford, Ontario. Anybody been there? 60 years ago, Stratford was a railroad town, and they lost the railroads. And they said, oh my God, what are we going to do? And they said, well, our name is Stratford. We're on the Avon River. Maybe we should have a Shakespeare festival. So the first play is Richard III. They had it under a tent that they imported from Chicago. Alec Guinness came in and played Richard III. And now Stratford now has 5 permanent theaters. They employ 1,000 people in the whole administration. They put on about a dozen plays a year, and it pumps tens of millions of dollars into Stratford. And Stratford's a town, smaller, I mean, it's a small town, but tens of millions of dollars a year into the economy. So you can find variations on this theme everywhere. Cities are looking very actively at this as a means not only to sort of get some, some sort of cultural boost, but also economic development boost too. And then there's our streets and there's sort of our public infrastructure problem. This is rush hour in Detroit. I live not far from here. This is 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning where I was through the middle of the street with this bunch. Now, if I stay there very long, I'll get run over. But the point is, when you build a city for 2 million people, and now you have 700,000, your roads are going to be empty a lot of the time. And once I started going on to this, I would just look at our roads in Detroit and be amazed at how overcapacity they were for the amount of traffic that we have. And so when we talk about using, underused urban assets in creative ways, one thing we're talking about is our road system. So one thing we're talking about in Detroit, and many look like, light rail. And this is a student image where you could take some of that excess lane capacity and use it for something new. So, and we are, in fact, we're probably the only major city, only top 25 city that doesn't have a light rail or rapid transit system. We have a little monorail that goes around downtown, but we don't have one because city-suburban relations have been so bad we can't agree on the regional transit system that we could have it. We may get one now. We're negotiating with the federal government to pay for one, so we may actually get one soon. But one way to use vacancy in overcapacity in roads is to do something like this. And of course, there's also bicycle lanes, which are happening all over the country. This is New York City. Mayor Bloomberg has gone, double down on bike lanes in New York to the extent that there's a backlash now in New York. A lot of the merchants don't like it that they lose parking spaces. And some of the residents that complain that guys like this go up the one way and go the wrong way. They call it salmoning because they go upstream. But bike lanes are everywhere right now. There's one in Pennsylvania has bike lanes in front of the Capitol building. So we're seeing this everywhere, and it's actually fairly easy to do. You wait till the next time you strike the road and you do this. And there's a cultural difference. Drivers in Detroit are not as bad as anywhere else. And when I ride on main streets in Detroit, I take sidewalks. When I bicycle on side streets, I use the street. But we're seeing sort of a growing number of places like this in New York. This is lower Manhattan, where you have what's complete streets. You take the streets not just for cars and trucks, it's for bicycles, people in wheelchairs, wider sidewalks for sidewalk cafes and that kind of stuff. And I know people from cities who've gone to a place like this and taken photos like this and said, well, maybe we could do something like this in our city. Even if it's not this, we could do something similar. And this is the famous High Line in New York City, decommissioned elevated train track. You think about reusing old factories or reusing infrastructure in this way. This is, of course, an amazing place. It's now about 2 miles or a mile and a half long. If you visit this on a busy Saturday in the summertime, it'll be so busy you can't hardly move on it. And all the buildings up and down the High Line advertise steps from the High Line. So this is a greenway, a linear park, that has become a real tool of economic development. And of course, at various ends of it, you sort of dump into these indoor shopping malls. So it's become a whole part of the infrastructure, tourism and otherwise, in that part of New York. Kalamazoo, Michigan is an example of a city that has daylighted some of their streams. Daylight means to open up a stream that's been buried in the past. All cities, all big cities, buried their streams, their natural streams 100 years or more ago, turned them into sewers and buried them underground. And there's a movement now to open these up and restore some of the natural landscape, both as an amenity, sort of a natural amenity, and also because it gives rainwater someplace to go. So in Kalamazoo, this is downtown Kalamazoo, and they had lots of flooded basements in downtown Kalamazoo until they daylighted Arcadia Creek. There's a whole campaign to do this. It's like, you can imagine, Mary, you can imagine how difficult it is to do an infrastructure project like this, but they got lots of development out of it. The buildings in the background all redeveloped as a result of this project, and they solved the wet basement problem. And so now cities across America are looking at daylighting as a possible thing to do. In Detroit, we're looking at it as a stream called Bloody Run Creek, so-called because the British fought the Indians there in 1763. And the foundations have given a lot of money to study this and they've done preliminary planning. And so it may or may not happen. But this kind of thing is also on the drawing board for a lot of our cities. And then I'd like to just swing by Europe because it seems to me that the Europeans are somewhat less timid than we are about reusing some of their vacant industrial assets. I'm going to stop in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial area of Germany first. This is an old steel mill that was abandoned, and now it's a light. They have a light show there. So this is a tourist attraction now, and you can come and have picnics, and they have concerts and lectures like this at places like this. They also have turned it into a recreational center, and they allow they call this the Heidelberg Project. They allow guys to come in and do this sort of thing. Now, I don't know very many American cities that will allow this kind of thing to happen in abandoned steel mills. Or how about something like this? I mean, it's a cool idea. One answer is that the Europeans were less litigious than we were. It makes a major difference. So anyway, Manchester, England. Talk about the home of the mills, the textile mills, the original home of the textile mills. All abandoned. I mean, Manchester lost its entire industrial base. They had their peak population, I think, was around 700,000. It cut down to 400,000, it was the Detroit of England. And they've been rebuilding in a lot of very creative ways. In one way, anybody know what these were originally? Shipping containers, right? These things come in filled with grain from China. It's too expensive to send them back empty, so they stack up by the thousands in port cities around the world. And here, these have been turned into office pods for entrepreneurs, digital entrepreneurs. Manchester is trying very hard to be sort of the digital capital of England outside London, and they're doing a pretty good job of it, actually. So they had this empty warehouse, and they're going to subdivide it into cubicles for entrepreneurs. And instead, they just lined up a bunch of these shipping containers, converted them with glass fronts into little office pods, and rented them out. And these rent for about $100 a month for a single. And they said when they started this, they had about 40 of them, and they thought they'd run 2 or 3 the first month. And instead, they rented all of them. And they said, we can't get people out of here, these are too popular. So this is the kind of thing that's done in Europe a lot, where they make shipping containers into schools, into housing, into hospitals, into all kinds of things. But it tends to find a kind of a somewhat negative response in America. I don't know too many places that have done this. We had someone propose it in Detroit about 5 years ago, and it sort of went nowhere. Mostly partly because the economy collapsed, but also because the city planning people just didn't know what to do with it. It was just too different. And then in Turin, Italy, Turin lost all of its industry. It was the auto capital of Italy. They took their downtown landmark building. This is the Mole. It was built as a synagogue in the mid-1800s. It was empty for a long time. When Turin lost the auto industry, they looked around and they realized, Turin in the early 1900s was the early home of Italian cinema, and we have all this memorabilia that we've collected. Let's turn this into a museum of Italian cinema. So they've done that, and now Turin is now the new home sort of Italian cinema, and they have festivals, they have training schools for animators and all that kind of stuff. And finally, in Leipzig, Germany. Leipzig's an interesting city that was in the old East Germany, and when communism fell and the wall opened, they lost 10% of the population overnight that moved out, and all of their industry, 90% of their industry disappeared almost overnight. So they have huge amounts of vacancy, and this is an empty building. And the city started a program. They've done many things that are interesting, but just one, the sign. I'll try to, it's in Baccarat, means guardian house. And the city started a program, the guardian house program, where they turned empty buildings like this over to nonprofit groups. And they said, just take it, do something positive with it. It doesn't need code. We're not going to worry about liability issues. We're not going to get after you whatever you do. Just do something positive, fill it up, keep the lights and heat on, and so on. So I saw this on a tour with some American planners from various cities. And they were all saying, well, this is wonderful, but how do we do it in America? I mean, what do you do about liability issues? What do you do about insurance issues, code violations? And the German says, well, we're not going to worry about that. Again, that's you guys in America. So, again, I just think the Europeans are a little less tentatively about trying certain kinds of things. And what I find interesting is that when I went to Europe on this trip to see a lot of these places, my editor said, well, of course it's easy in Europe, they're all socialists. But in fact, what's interesting, the things that they've accomplished is accomplished because they're more entrepreneurial. The private-public partnerships, which we have a lot of, and we're developing more of them, they're even more sort of entrepreneurial, I found, in some places in Europe. So anyway, that's kind of a whirlwind tour of some of the things that are happening. As Mayor Mitchell said at the beginning, the key here is that you take stuff that you think is a problem, and you start thinking about it as an asset. And you can't be Pollyanna and say, oh, suddenly it's wonderful. It's not. It's still a problem. But at least you're thinking about it in new and creative ways. And this kind of stuff is happening all over, and I think that there's, again, not to be a Pollyanna about the problems facing our cities with the place of here, but there's too many smart people in too many places working on too many innovative things not to produce some good results. So with that, I'd just like to turn it over to your thoughts, comments, questions.